Welcome to Shredder Fanfic. Like, subscribe, and hype video. Join members to gain early access to new videos.
The main character, after dying in his previous life, he wakes up as Tony's brother inside of Marvel, and he creates the Zerg Queen. What is he gonna do inside of Marvel?
Or held, but barely. Loki's illusions. Loki raised his free hand, and 3 copies of him stepped out from the shadows. Each looked identical, staff raised, eyes gleaming. Natasha fired immediately, her shots passing through one illusion harmlessly. Clint loosed arrows, 2 of them shattering into smoke as they struck. The real Loki moved in the chaos, his staff slamming into a beetle drone. The shell cracked, the creature falling in pieces. He swung again, hurling a blast into the resin wall. The structure shattered, rubble collapsing onto the street. Workers scuttled instantly to reseal, their mandibles clamping furiously. Ant soldiers pressed harder, snapping at the illusions even as their claws passed through smoke. Steve braced in the center of it, his shield ringing with every strike. I keyed the console again, sharp. Wasp Wing 11 cut him off. The sky filled with wings as thousands of drones dove onto Loki. Their mandibles clamped onto his armor, their claws raking at his skin. For a moment, he staggered under the weight. Then a blast erupted from his staff, vaporizing hundreds instantly. The rest pressed tighter anyway. Avengers versus Loki. Steve lunged, his shield slamming into Loki's chest. The impact hurled the god backward into the street, cracking asphalt under him. Natasha banked low, firing another burst into his side. Clint loosed another arrow, the explosion flaring across his armor. Loki rose slowly, his smirk unfazed. His staff flared again, a blast striking Steve square in the shield. The force hurled him into the resin wall, cracking it with the impact. The queen's mandibles snapped, her drones swarming harder around Loki. Resin smeared across the ground, locking his feet in place. Loki snarled, slamming his staff down again. The resin shattered, the queen's drones flung in all directions. Steve staggered back into position, his shield raised. Natasha reloaded quickly, her face tight. Clint drew another arrow, his jaw clenched. The civilians still moved through the corridor, the swarm sealing cracks behind them. The line hadn't broken yet. Other fronts hold. On the southern bridge, Tony's voice came through comms, clipped. Not to interrupt, but I've still got a Leviathan chewing through steel down here. Hulk's roar echoed from the west, the feed shaking as his fists smashed into another beast's skull. Ant queens and beetle drones pressed harder into its flanks, resin sealing every joint. Steve's voice came rough but steady. We've got Loki in the north. Hold your lines. Easy for you to say, Tony muttered. I keyed the console, my voice cheerful but firm. Relax. We'll handle the god of mischief. You just handle your overgrown lizard. Loki's push. Loki raised his staff high, energy gathering at the tip. The glow flared bright, the heat burning even through the monitors. I keyed the command instantly. Beetle Queen 7, shield. The massive queen surged in front of Steve, her shell braced. The blast struck her full force, the shell cracking but holding. Smoke poured off her body as drones swarmed tighter to reinforce her. Steve pushed forward again, his shield raised behind her. Natasha fired into Loki's side, Clint's arrow striking another illusion. The swarm pressed closer. Workers smeared resin across his feet again, locking him tighter into the street. Wasp drones swarmed his head, their mandibles snapping into his skin. Ant soldiers clamped onto his arms, forcing them down. For the first time, Loki strained against the weight. The civilians kept moving through the corridor. Police pushed them faster, guiding them into buses waiting at the far end. Resin walls sealed behind them, workers patching every crack. Steve didn't take his eyes off Loki. His voice came sharp over comms. Don't let him break the line. Natasha answered quickly, not planning to. Clint's arrow loosed again. the explosion flaring across Loki's chest. The swarm tightened further, resin sealing his legs in place. Loki's smirk finally faded. Chapter 45. Thor joins the fight. Loki's staff burned with blue light. Resin cracked around his feet as he forced against it, his sneer returning despite the weight of ants and wasps clamping into him. Another blast surged outward, vaporizing a line of drones and hurling a beetle shell across the street. The northern corridor shook. Steve pressed forward again, his shield raised, teeth clenched. Natasha crouched behind a broken car, her pistols firing in precise bursts. Clint loosed another arrow from the rooftop, his jaw tight as the shot detonated against Loki's chest plate. It only staggered him for a second. Then the sky cracked with thunder. A streak of lightning shot down from above, slamming into the pavement beside Loki. The shockwave ripped through the street, blasting Chitauri squads into the air. Resin walls rattled but held. Loki's head whipped up, his sneer vanished. Thor landed in the crater, Mjolnir in his hand. "Brother," Thor said, his voice steady but edged. Loki's eyes narrowed, his staff lifting again. You never know when to stay away. Steve let out a quick breath of relief, but he didn't lower his shield. About time. I leaned back in my chair, smiling faintly as I watched the feed. Finally, the family reunion. Thor didn't hesitate. He swung Mjolnir in a wide arc, the hammer slamming into Loki's chest. The impact hurled him across the avenue, his body smashing through a resin wall. Drones scattered as the structure collapsed around him. Civilians screamed but kept moving, police urging them forward faster. Workers patched the new gap instantly, resin spreading across the rubble. Loki rose slowly, his sneer gone, his eyes burning. His staff flared with energy as he stepped back into the street. Thor planted himself in front of Steve, his hammer raised. "Stay behind me." Steve adjusted his shield but didn't move. "Not how I work." Natasha reloaded her pistols calmly. "Let's just focus on him staying down." Clint's bowstring creaked as he drew another arrow. Seconded. The swarm tightened, queens pushing their drones closer to the front. Ant soldiers formed a solid line across the corridor, mandibles snapping in sharp rhythm. Wasps circled above, their wings buzzing loud. The fight shifted. Loki swung his staff in a wide arc, blue energy blasting through the street. Ant soldiers were hurled back, resin walls cracking under the shock. Thor charged through the blast, his hammer swinging again. Sparks erupted as Mjolnir struck the staff. The shockwave rattled the avenue, the two brothers locked in a push that cracked the pavement under their feet. Steve braced beside Thor, his shield raised high to block stray fire from Chitauri squads. Natasha ducked into the rubble, picking off soldiers trying to flank. Clint's arrow loosed into the Leviathan pressing from behind, exploding across its flank. The civilians kept moving, their faces pale but their feet steady as workers dragged them through the corridor. The swarm sealed every gap. Thor shoved Loki back, lightning sparking across the hammer. The blast lit the street, the force scattering nearby Chitauri. Loki snarled, raising his staff again. He slammed it into the ground, illusions flickering out instantly. A dozen copies of him stepped forward, each identical, each staff raised. Wasps dove onto the illusions, their mandibles snapping through empty smoke. Ant soldiers clamped down only to find their claws meeting nothing. Steve didn't falter. He threw his shield, the disc slicing through two illusions before striking the real Loki's chest. The trickster staggered, his smirk breaking as he caught himself against the rubble. Thor didn't give him time to recover. He charged again, Mjolnir slamming into Loki's side. The god flew across the street, crashing into a Chitauri squad. They scattered instantly, their weapons clattering. The swarm surged forward, sealing the breach tighter. Loki rose slowly again, his breathing sharper now. His staff trembled faintly in his hand. He looked between Thor, Steve, Natasha, and Clint, then at the waves of drones pressing tighter around him. His sneer returned, thinner this time. This changes nothing. Thor spun Mjolnir in his hand, lightning sparking across the hammer. It changes everything. Steve shifted his shield higher, his voice steady. Focus. Natasha ducked out from cover, her pistols firing sharp bursts. Clint loosed another arrow, this one striking Loki's staff and detonating in sparks. The swarm surged tighter, mandibles clamping, resin sealing. For the first time, Loki stepped back. The Leviathan behind him roared, trying to push further into the corridor. Its body scraped against buildings, glass raining down in sheets. Thor turned sharply, his hammer sparking. Hold him, he ordered. Steve nodded without hesitation. Go. Thor leapt, Mjolnir dragging him upward into the air. Lightning streaked across the sky as he slammed into the Leviathan's skull. The impact cracked its armor wide, ichor spraying down onto the street. Wasps swarmed into the wound instantly, their claws tearing the gap wider. Ant soldiers clambered up the beast's limbs, locking it tighter into the avenue. The civilians screamed at the sight, but they kept moving. Loki sneered faintly, but his eyes flicked toward Thor in clear frustration. He raised his staff again, blasting into the swarm to clear a path. Steve lunged, his shield striking Loki's side. Natasha fired sharp bursts, Clint loosed another arrow. The god staggered, his sneer finally breaking into a snarl. The corridor held. Thor's hammer struck the Leviathan again, lightning burning through its skull. The beast roared once more, then crashed into the buildings on either side. Entire walls collapsed as it slumped forward, ichor spreading across the avenue. The swarm tore into its body instantly, resin sealing it against the street. Thor landed in the rubble, his hammer raised again. His jaw tightened as he turned back toward Loki. The civilians were nearly clear. The Avengers didn't stop pressing. Chapter 46, pinned in the corridor. The Leviathan's carcass smoked in the rubble behind Thor. Resin already spread across its armor, sealing its weight into the street. Ant soldiers clambered over its body, tearing stray Chitauri from its hide. Wasps circled above, their wings buzzing loud in the smoky air. The civilians were almost clear. The last buses at the end of the corridor rolled forward under police escort, engines groaning. Workers clung to their sides, sealing windows with resin as they moved. But Loki still stood in the avenue. His armor was scuffed, ichor streaked across his cheek from the swarm's claws. His sneer was tight, his breathing sharp, but the staff in his hand still pulsed bright. He twirled it once, and the blue glow flared stronger. Thor stepped forward, hammer raised, his expression set. Yield, brother. Loki laughed softly, shaking his head. You never understood. Steve cut him off, his shield raised high. Stop talking. Natasha moved behind the wreck of a car, her pistols snapping into ready aim. Clint crouched low on the rooftop, another arrow notched, his eyes steady. The swarm pressed closer. Ant soldiers clamped their mandibles, forming a half circle across the avenue. Wasps hovered just above, ready to dive at the first command. Workers smeared resin into cracks across the pavement, narrowing Loki's footing. He glanced between them all, his sneer flickering as he realized the noose tightening. Loki struck first. The staff flared, a blast ripping across the street. Resin shattered in wide sheets, ant soldiers vaporized instantly. A beetle drone crumpled, its shell split clean. Thor charged through the smoke, Mjolnir raised. The hammer met the staff in a violent crack, sparks erupting in bright arcs. Loki's arm trembled against the force. Steve lunged in from the side, his shield smashing into Loki's ribs. The god staggered, his sneer breaking as he slammed into the pavement. The swarm surged instantly. Workers smeared resin across his legs, pinning them to the asphalt. Ant soldiers swarmed up his arms, their mandibles clamping into the joints of his armor. Wasps dove onto his back, their claws tearing into the straps of his cape. Loki snarled, blasting upward in desperation. The wave of energy vaporized a dozen drones, but resin spread over his chest again, forcing him lower. Thor stepped forward, hammer raised. Steve planted himself beside him, shield braced. The corridor shifted into a cage. Natasha ducked from cover, her pistols firing in tight bursts into Loki's free hand. Sparks flared off his gauntlet, forcing his grip tighter on the staff. Clint's arrow loosed, striking Loki's shoulder. The explosion cracked the armor, ichor spraying as he staggered further under the weight. Ant soldiers piled higher, their mandibles forcing his arms down. Resin hardened in layers, sealing his chest to the pavement. Thor lifted Mjolnir, lightning sparking across its head. Stay down. Loki spat through clenched teeth. Never. Thor slammed the hammer into the ground beside his brother's head. Lightning burst outward, the shockwave rattling the avenue. Chitauri squads nearby scattered instantly, their weapons dropping. Loki flinched, his sneer faltering. The swarm sealed tighter. Steve pressed his shield against Loki's chest, bracing the resin as it hardened around him. His voice carried steady. That's far enough. Natasha's pistol stayed trained, her stance unmoving. Clint drew another arrow, his aim fixed directly between Loki's eyes. Workers layered resin across his staff, hardening over the glowing tip. Ant soldiers clamped his wrists down tighter, their mandibles snapping furiously. For the first time since landing in the street, Loki couldn't rise. He strained, his sneer twisting into a snarl, but the resin held. Every movement was met by more drones, every crack sealed in seconds. Thor stood over him, Mjolnir ready, his chest heaving. Loki was pinned. The corridor quieted for the first time since the battle began. The last buses cleared the far end, their engines fading into the distance. Civilians were gone. The swarm shifted into guard formation, their bodies ringing Loki in a dense wall. Wasps hovered above in tight circles, their mandibles snapping. Steve lowered his shield slightly, his jaw tightening. He's not moving anywhere. Natasha holstered one pistol, but kept the other steady. Not yet. Clint eased his bowstring, but the arrow remained notched. I'll believe it when I see it. Thor exhaled, his hammer lowering an inch. His voice stayed flat. He must be brought back to the tower. Steve glanced at him, his tone clipped. Then let's move him before he gets clever. I keyed the console, my tone cheerful again. Don't worry, my friends will walk him home. Loki's eyes flicked up at the sound of my voice, his sneer returning faintly despite the resin crusting his chest. So, you're the one meddling with beasts. I smirked at the screen. Glad you noticed. The soldiers snapped their mandibles, dragging his arms lower. He snarled again, but the resin sealed thicker across his body. Pinned meant pinned. Thor reached down, Mjolnir still sparking faintly. He pressed it against Loki's chest, pinning the staff fully under its weight. Loki strained against it, his teeth clenched, but he couldn't lift either weapon or hammer. Steve planted himself beside Thor, shield raised in case the god tried one more trick. Natasha moved closer, her eyes never leaving Loki's face. Clint shifted along the rooftop, his arrow always drawn. The swarm didn't move, their bodies forming the walls of the corridor. The civilians were gone. The fight was over, for now. Chapter 47, Walking the Prisoner. Loki struggled, but the resin clamped tighter each time he moved. His legs were bound thick to the pavement, his chest locked in a hardened shell. Even his staff was sealed under Mjolnir's weight, blue light flickering uselessly at the edges. Thor stood over him, hammer planted against his armor. Steve braced nearby with his shield high, watching for another trick. Natasha crouched close with one pistol still trained, while Clint shifted on the rooftop above, his arrow never leaving Loki's head. The civilians were gone. The corridor was quiet now, only the crackle of fire and the buzz of swarm wings filling the air. I leaned closer to the monitors, smiling faintly. All right, now we get to the fun part. Time to take him home. Steve gave a short nod. We move him to the tower. Thor pressed harder with Mjolnir. He will not walk willingly. That's why my friends will carry him, I said cheerfully. At my command, the ant soldiers tightened their grip. Mandibles clamped deeper into resin, locking Loki's arms and legs. Beetle drones braced themselves behind him, their shells ready to drag. Workers layered more secretion across his sides, thickening the bonds until he looked encased in black stone. Loki sneered faintly, his voice low. You think insects will hold me? Thor's reply was blunt. Yes. The swarm lifted. The ants dragged him first, hundreds straining against the resin bindings. His body scraped across the cracked asphalt, staff still pinned under Mjolnir clutched tight by Thor. Beetles pushed from behind, steadying the movement, while wasps circled high to guard the air. Steve moved beside them, shield raised. Natasha flanked the other side, her eyes scanning every rooftop. Clint shifted from one building to the next, his bow always drawn, watching for threats above. Thor walked at the head, hammer sparking faintly, his gaze fixed on Loki's face. The procession began. The swarm surrounded them on every side, forming a moving barricade that sealed the street as they advanced. Resin walls went up behind them as they passed, cutting off pursuit. Loki strained once, his sneer curling tighter. Resin cracked faintly at his wrist. Immediately, 3 workers scuttled up, smearing fresh layers until the movement stopped. Steve glanced down at him briefly. Don't bother. Loki's smirk didn't fade. The first ambush came 3 blocks later. Chitauri squads dropped from rooftops, their rifles blazing into the street. Energy blasts cracked resin, drones bursting under the fire. Steve raised his shield, catching the first volley. Natasha ducked behind rubble, her pistols firing sharp bursts. Clint loosed 3 arrows in quick succession, each explosion scattering squads before they landed. Thor hurled Mjolnir into the nearest rooftop. The hammer crashed through a squad, shattering their weapons before whipping back into his hand. Lightning sparked across his shoulders as he turned to the next. The swarm surged forward. Wasps dove in waves, dragging riders off the rooftops. Ant soldiers leapt at the squads, their mandibles snapping through armor. Beetles planted themselves in the gaps, shells braced against fire. Loki was dragged straight through the center, his sneer curling wider despite the chaos. Your allies struggle. My army does not tire. Steve pushed forward without looking at him. Neither do they, he said, glancing at the drones swarming overhead. I laughed faintly through the comms. He's not wrong. My friends don't stop. The street cleared in minutes. Resin walls sealed the rubble, locking the corpses inside. The march continued. The second ambush came faster. 2 Chitauri skiffs swooped low, their weapons pounding into the formation. Blasts cracked the resin walls, drones bursting under the heat. One beam struck a beetle's shell, burning through until it crumpled onto its side. Thor raised his hammer instantly, lightning surging into the sky. The bolt cracked through both skiffs, shattering them into pieces. The wreckage rained onto the street, scattering across the swarm. Natasha ducked under falling debris, rolling to her feet and firing into a squad that slipped through. Steve met them with his shield, the disc smashing into the first soldier's jaw before ricocheting into the next. Clint's arrow loosed again, detonating across the last cluster. The ants didn't pause. They dragged Loki forward, resin leaving grooves across the pavement. Beetles steadied him, workers patching cracks the blasts had opened. Wasps circled tighter, their wings buzzing louder as they blocked the next wave. Loki twisted faintly, his smirk widening. You cannot win. The portal remains open. Thor pressed Mjolnir harder into his chest, lightning sparking against the resin. You will not gloat long. The swarm pressed forward. Block by block, they advanced. Every street meant another skirmish. Chitauri poured from alleys, dropped from rooftops, streaked across the sky on skiffs. Each time, Steve braced, Natasha fired, Clint loosed, Thor swung, and the swarm surged. Workers sealed breaches as fast as they opened. Ant soldiers clamped mandibles into every gap. Wasps ripped riders from the sky. Beetles braced against fire until their shells cracked. The formation never stopped. Loki was dragged through it all, resin tightening with each step. His sneer stayed fixed, but the tension in his jaw betrayed the strain. I leaned forward, my voice cheerful through the comms. Almost there, towers in sight. Tony's voice cut in, sharp over the roar of repulsors. Good, because we've got Leviathans circling the top floor. You'd better hurry. Thor grunted low, his hammer sparking brighter. Then we shall. The swarm pressed harder, their pace quickening despite the constant fire. The last ambush came at the foot of Stark Tower. Dozens of Chitauri squads poured into the avenue, blocking the street in solid lines. Skiffs circled above, their weapons glowing bright. And behind them, another Leviathan twisted low, its roar rattling the glass. Steve braced his shield. Final push. Thor lifted Mjolnir, lightning sparking across the hammer. Natasha reloaded both pistols, her jaw set. Clint notched 3 arrows at once, his eyes steady. I keyed the command instantly. All wings converge. The sky darkened as wasps dove in massive waves. Ant soldiers poured into the avenue, their mandibles snapping. Beetles surged ahead, bracing into a living wall. Workers smeared resin across the street in long arcs, sealing paths around the formation. The clash shook the tower's base. Thor hurled Mjolnir into the Leviathan's jaw, lightning burning across its skull. Steve slammed into the squads at the front, his shield breaking their line. Natasha's pistols cut down every soldier that slipped through, while Clint's arrows burst across the skiffs. The swarm flooded the rest. Wasps dragged riders off their mounts. Ants clamped into alien throats. Beetles pushed the line forward, their shells cracking but unyielding. Resin hardened across the Leviathan's limbs, forcing it lower. The formation cut through the blockade, dragging Loki straight to the tower's base. He sneered faintly, his voice low. This will not hold. Thor pressed Mjolnir harder into his chest, his voice flat. It will. The swarm sealed him tighter, resin hardening until even his sneer froze into a grimace. The Avengers gathered around, their weapons steady, the tower rising above them. The prisoner was home, Chapter 48, locking the tower. The tower's lobby was shattered glass and smoking steel by the time we forced Loki inside. Ant soldiers hauled him across the floor, resin scraping the marble. Beetles braced the doorways, their shells pressed into shattered frames. Workers scuttled over the cracked walls, smearing black layers into seams until no gaps remained. Thor kept Mjolnir planted against Loki's chest the whole way, the hammer's head sparking faintly with each step. Steve moved alongside him, shield raised even though the god barely twitched under the weight. Natasha covered their rear, her pistols snapping up at every sound. Clint stayed higher, moving across broken mezzanines, an arrow always drawn. The wasps circled above, their shadows crossing the ruined glass as they swarmed the tower's top floors. Every entrance was sealed. Every corridor was patrolled. The tower had become a hive. Loki's sneer twitched faintly as he was dragged past the ruined reception desk. You defile his monument with vermin. Thor pressed the hammer harder. It will serve as your prison. I grinned faintly from the console. You'll get used to the company. The ground shook again as another Leviathan crashed against the tower's base. Glass fell from the upper floors in heavy sheets. Civilians screamed in the streets outside as Chitauri fire echoed. Steve glanced up quickly, jaw tight. They'll keep pushing. Then we keep sealing, I answered. At my command, the swarm moved. Workers dragged resin in thick streams across the lobby's glass, layering over cracks until the light from outside was barely visible. Ant soldiers climbed the stairwells, mandibles snapping in sharp rhythm as they took position. Beetles braced the main door completely, their shells pressed so tight together they formed a wall. Thor hauled Loki toward the center of the lobby, Mjolnir never leaving his chest. He must stay bound. Resin's stronger than it looks, I said cheerfully. But just in case, don't move that hammer. Thor gave a firm nod, his eyes never leaving Loki's face. Natasha crouched low by a shattered window, scanning the skyline with sharp eyes. The portal's still open. Clint dropped down from the mezzanine, his bowstring still taut, and more are coming through every second. Steve turned quickly, his shield lowering slightly. Banner. On the upper feed, Hulk's roar rattled through the comms as he ripped a skiff in half. He was still fighting in the west, surrounded by drones pouring resin across the streets. Tony's voice cut in, strained but fast. Don't worry about me. I'm just flying laps with giant space worms. Somebody get that portal closed already. Steve's gaze shifted to Natasha. She nodded once. I'll get up there. Thor's grip tightened on the hammer, his jaw set. I go with you. Steve gave a short nod. Then go, Stark, guide them in. Tony muttered back, his repulsors whining. Yeah, I'll roll out the red carpet. Natasha and Thor sprinted for the stairwell, a line of workers clearing rubble from their path. Wasps circled above them as escort, their mandibles snapping loud in the broken halls. Clint moved to the opposite side of the lobby, scanning the streets outside through the cracks. They're massing again. Steve tightened his grip on the shield. Then we hold until they shut it. I keyed the console. No problem, queens are already moving. The ground trembled as another wave of swarm arrived from the islands. The wasp wings blackened the sky above the tower, clamping onto every Chitauri skiff that came near. Ant soldiers poured into the streets, forming barricades around the base. Beetles braced in the rubble, their shells glowing under the fire. The tower held. Inside, Loki twisted faintly, resin cracking around his wrist. Instantly, workers scuttled over, layering more secretion until the crack sealed. His sneer curled, but the movement stopped. Steve crouched down briefly, his shield still braced. You're not going anywhere. Loki's reply was calm despite the strain. You think cages will stop me? Steve didn't answer. He stood again, his eyes shifting back to the doorway as another blast shook the walls. The swarm pressed tighter. Up above, the comms crackled with Natasha's voice. I'm in position. Banner's guidance was right. I can shut it down. Thor's voice followed, firm. I will hold the invaders. The feed caught him smashing Mjolnir into the rooftop, lightning scattering squads of Chitauri that tried to intercept her. Natasha sprinted through the smoke, reaching the Tesseract device. Her voice came sharp through the line. I can close it. Steve's voice steadied immediately. Do it. On the monitors, the portal flared once, then began to contract. The blue light twisted tighter, the edges folding inward. The massive shadow of another Leviathan bent halfway through, then sliced in two as the rift shrank shut. The roar of Chitauri filled the city, then faltered. The remaining soldiers on the ground twitched violently, their bodies locking in place. Skiffs froze midair before collapsing into the streets. The Leviathans slumped, their limbs slack. The invasion died in seconds. The city was silent. In the lobby, Steve exhaled slowly, lowering his shield. Clint relaxed his bowstring, his eyes narrowing as he looked out at the frozen battlefield. Thor's voice came back over comms, steady. It is done. Natasha followed, her tone clipped. Portals closed. Tony let out a long groan over the line. Finally, you're welcome, by the way. Hulk's roar rumbled faintly in the distance, more annoyed than triumphant. I leaned back in my chair, grinning faintly. Told you it'd work out. Steve didn't smile. His gaze dropped to the lobby floor, where resin-coated corpses of Chitauri soldiers still twitched faintly. Dozens lay piled near the barricades, their armor cracked, their weapons shattered. His voice came low, steady. "What do we do with the bodies?" I answered simply, "My hive can eat them." Clint raised an eyebrow, glancing at me across the lobby. "That's efficient." Natasha's reply carried through comms, flat. "Better than leaving them to rot." Steve's jaw tightened, but he gave a short nod. "Do it." At my command, the swarm moved. Workers surged over the corpses in thick streams, mandibles snapping. Ant soldiers dragged larger pieces into piles, their claws locking into limbs. Beetles cracked armor with the weight of their shells. Wasps hovered low, their claws tearing into wreckage. The lobby filled with the steady sound of feeding. Loki's sneer twitched faintly, his eyes shifting to the swarm devouring his army. Thor pressed Mjolnir harder into his chest. "Your war is finished." The resin sealed tighter as the swarm continued to eat. The tower was locked. The invasion was over. Chapter 49, Fury at the Tower. The lobby smelled like smoke, resin, and blood. Ant soldiers still worked in lines, dragging broken Chitauri into piles for the workers to consume. Beetles braced against shattered glass panes, their shells blotting out the ruined skyline. Wasps hovered above the tower's roofline, their buzzing constant. In the center of the room, Loki lay pinned in resin, Mjolnir locked across his chest. He sneered faintly at the chaos around him, but didn't move. Thor stood over him, hammer steady, while Steve leaned against a cracked pillar, shield still in hand. Natasha reloaded her pistols, even though the fighting had stopped, and Clint crouched near an open window, his bow across his knees. The only sound beyond the swarm was the faint creak of broken steel in the tower above. That quiet ended when the elevator dinged. The doors opened onto black-suited SHIELD agents, rifles raised. They swept the lobby in practiced formation before parting to let Nick Fury step through. His one eye swept across the wreckage, then narrowed at the sight of Loki bound under resin and hammer. His jaw tightened, but his voice stayed calm. "I see you've been busy." Steve straightened, adjusting the strap of his shield. "The invasion's over." Fury's gaze shifted to the walls, where drones still crawled over Chitauri bodies, tearing into them. His tone sharpened. "And what the hell is that?" I smiled faintly, leaning against the console. "Cleanup crew." Fury's eye flicked to me. "You brought them here." "They saved the city," Steve cut in quickly, his voice firm. Fury didn't look at him. His gaze stayed locked on the resin walls, the drones clamping their mandibles into dead Chitauri. His jaw flexed before he turned back. "We'll talk about that later. Right now, we're here for him." He nodded toward Loki. Thor pressed Mjolnir harder into his brother's chest, lightning crackling faintly. "He does not leave my sight." Fury's tone stayed even. "He goes into SHIELD custody." Thor's eyes narrowed, his grip on the hammer unmoving. "He will face Asgardian justice." Steve stepped between them quickly, his shield raised slightly. "One thing at a time. We need him secured before he causes more damage." Loki's sneer curled faintly, but he didn't speak. Fury gestured, and two agents stepped forward with reinforced cuffs glowing faintly with blue light. Stark tech, by the look of it. They crouched near Loki, but the drones snapped their mandibles instantly, forcing them to stop. Fury's gaze cut back to me. "Call them off." I crossed my arms, smiling faintly. "You really want him without backup?" Fury's voice dropped lower, his tone flat. "They don't answer to you, not in my city." Steve's voice steadied again. "They helped. Without them, we wouldn't be standing here." Natasha holstered one pistol, her expression unreadable. "He's right. They kept the lines together." Fury didn't glance at her. His eye stayed locked on me. "Doesn't change who controls them." Thor slammed Mjolnir harder into Loki's chest, cutting the tension. The god grunted faintly under the pressure. Thor's voice rumbled. You may argue later. He is not to be moved without me. Fury exhaled slowly, his jaw tight. Then he nodded once. Fine. He stays under the hammer, but he's coming with us. Steve gave a short nod, his voice steady. We'll escort. Fury's gaze lingered on me for another long second before he turned back to his agents. Get the transport ready. While S.H.I.E.L.D. prepared, the swarm continued their work. Workers moved in disciplined lines, their mandibles dripping with ichor. They stripped Chitauri corpses clean, carrying the remains into resin pits dug into the tower floor. Ant soldiers stood guard along the walls, their bodies braced against shattered frames. Beetles blocked the main doors entirely, their shells overlapping like armor plates. Fury watched all of it with a stiff posture. He finally turned back to Steve. You know what this looks like? Steve's jaw tightened. It looks like survival. Natasha's tone was calmer. You needed an army. You had one. Clint didn't look up from restringing his bow. Worked better than half the weapons you fielded. Fury's eye narrowed slightly, but he didn't argue. Thor finally lifted Mjolnir off Loki's chest, only to slam it back down on the god's staff, pinning it fully to the ground. He moves when I say. Loki smirked faintly despite the resin clamping his limbs. Such authority, brother. Thor didn't reply. The agents moved in again, this time slower. They slid the glowing cuffs over Loki's wrists, layering them atop the resin. Blue light flared as the locks engaged. His sneer twitched, but the bonds held. Fury gave a short nod. Transport's ready. Steve raised his shield slightly. Then, let's go. At my command, the drones shifted. Ant soldiers dragged Loki forward, beetles bracing from behind. Wasps circled the ceiling, their shadows sweeping across the ruined lobby. Fury's gaze followed every movement, his jaw tight, but he didn't stop them. The march began again. Outside the tower, the city lay in ruins. Cars burned in long rows, smoke rose from collapsed skyscrapers, and Chitauri wreckage littered the streets. The swarm was everywhere, crawling over rubble, dragging corpses, sealing cracks. Civilians peered from broken windows, their faces pale at the sight of insects swarming through their city. Fury's jaw tightened at the stairs. They'll have questions. I smirked faintly. Let them ask. Steve didn't look at either of us. His shield stayed high, his voice steady. Keep moving. The column pressed toward the waiting transport. Loki sneered faintly as he was dragged across the street. Parading me like a beast. How noble. Thor's grip on the hammer didn't loosen. You will answer for your crimes. Natasha walked close behind, her pistols ready. Keep talking. It changes nothing. Clint's arrow stayed trained, his eyes scanning rooftops. We've got movement. Chitauri stragglers dropped from a nearby alley, their rifles firing wildly. Steve raised his shield instantly, deflecting the first volley. Thor swung Mjolnir, lightning scattering the rest. Natasha's pistols snapped twice, dropping two more. Clint's arrow loosed, exploding across the last. The swarm surged forward, wasps tearing stragglers apart midair. Ant soldiers clamped their mandibles into the wreckage, dragging it clear of the street. The fight ended in seconds. Loki laughed softly, shaking his head. You cannot guard me forever. Steve tightened his grip on the shield. Long enough. The march continued. The transport waited at the end of the avenue, a reinforced jet, engines whining faintly. S.H.I.E.L.D. agents stood in formation around it, rifles steady. Fury stepped forward, his voice sharp. Load him. Thor didn't move. His hammer stayed planted against Loki's chest. I go with him. Fury's gaze hardened. That wasn't the arrangement. Steve stepped between them again, his shield raised. It is now. He doesn't leave without Thor. Natasha's voice was calm, even. Better this way. You don't want him loose mid-flight. Clint muttered from the side. Or anywhere, really. Fury's eye flicked across each of them before settling back on Thor. Finally, he gave a short nod. Fine, but he's S.H.I.E.L.D's prisoner. Thor didn't reply. He just pressed the hammer harder into Loki's chest. The swarm braced around the transport, their mandibles snapping in sharp rhythm. Loki sneered faintly, his voice low. You've won nothing. Thor's jaw tightened. You will see. The transport's ramp lowered. Chapter 50, Flight with a Prisoner. The transport ramp hissed as it lifted, sealing us inside the jet. The interior smelled of metal and fuel, sharp under the lingering smoke from the city. Rows of reinforced seats lined either wall, while the center had been cleared for Loki's containment. He lay pinned in resin, Mjolnir pressed against his chest. The blue cuff still glowed faintly around his wrists, but his sneer hadn't faded. Thor sat directly over him, hammer firm, his posture rigid. Steve took the bench closest, shield propped against his knee, eyes fixed ahead. Natasha sat further down, her pistols rechecked before she holstered them. Clint leaned against the wall opposite, bow across his lap, expression calm but watchful. I sat at the rear, tapping at a handheld console patched into the swarm network. The feed showed drones circling the jet in tight formation, their wings buzzing faintly even through the hull. Across from us, Fury stood with his arms folded, his one eye watching every detail. The agents lining the walls looked tense, their rifles gripped tight. The engines roared, and the jet lifted. The ruined skyline of Manhattan dropped away beneath us, smoke curling into the sky. No one spoke for the first few minutes. The silence broke when Loki laughed softly. You've caged me like an animal, he said, his voice smooth despite the resin pinning him. But you can't keep me here forever. Thor pressed Mjolnir harder into his chest, lightning sparking faintly. Silence. Loki tilted his head, smirk widening. Still the obedient son, always swinging your hammer when words fail. Steve shifted slightly, his shield lifting a fraction. His tone stayed calm. Ignore him. Natasha didn't glance up from checking her weapon. He wants attention. Clint muttered from his corner, and an opening. Loki's eyes flicked toward me, then to the screen on my console showing the swarm in flight. His smirk thinned. Those things eating my army. I smiled cheerfully. They were hungry. Fury's gaze cut toward me instantly. His jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. Thor's hammer stayed pressed down. Loki's smirk faded. The flight steadied. The hum of the engines filled the silence. Outside the window, the swarm was visible, black streams of wings keeping pace with the jet. Below them, ant freighters rolled across highways, carrying drones in disciplined lines. Steve broke the quiet after a while, his voice even. How far? Fury answered curtly, not long. Clint smirked faintly. Not long's a relative term when we've got Chatterbox in the middle. Loki's sneer twitched at that. I can keep silent if you prefer, but you'll only hear the sound of your own fear. Natasha looked up at him coldly. You're the only one afraid here. For the first time, Loki didn't answer. He strained faintly against the resin, but the bonds didn't budge. Fury finally turned, his eye fixed on me. What happens to your creatures when this is over? I kept my tone light. They eat, they sleep, they grow. His jaw tightened. And if S.H.I.E.L.D. tells you to disband them? I grinned faintly. Then S.H.I.E.L.D. better have a plan for the next invasion. Steve cut in before Fury could reply. They've proven their worth. They stay. Fury didn't look away from me. That's not your call. Steve's voice was firmer this time. It's mine too. The air went quiet again. Loki's smirk returned faintly, watching the tension. Thor pressed the hammer down harder, forcing his brother silent. Half an hour into the flight, the first shake hit. The hull rattled, lights flickering once. Agents shifted, rifles raising instinctively. Fury barked, status. The pilot's voice crackled through the comm. Turbulence, sir. We're clear. I checked the console. Drones outside shifted formation, their wings buzzing sharper. No enemy signatures nearby, just debris still falling from the sky as the city smoldered below. The swarm steadied, the jet leveled, and the tension eased again. Clint exhaled, could use less bumps. Natasha didn't look up. Focus. Steve stayed silent, his eyes scanning every inch of the cabin. Thor didn't move, his hammer unmoving on Loki's chest. Loki's smirk returned faintly. How fragile this cage must be, shaking at the sky's whim. Thor's voice came steady. You will not break it. An hour passed with only the hum of engines and the occasional drone buzz outside. The agents shifted uneasily, but didn't lower their rifles. Fury stood rigid, his gaze never leaving Loki. Steve spoke again, his tone steady. When we land, he needs maximum security. Thor answered without hesitation. He comes to Asgard. Fury's reply was curt. He goes to S.H.I.E.L.D. Steve's jaw tightened. That's not for us to decide right now. First we land. Loki laughed softly again, his voice calm. How noble, argue over where to bury me. Thor leaned down, his eyes hard. You will be judged. Natasha's reply was flat. He likes this. Let him talk to himself. Clint smirked faintly. That's what I'm doing. The jet rattled again, lighter this time. The swarm outside shifted closer, wings buzzing louder. The flight pressed on. 2 hours in, Fury finally broke the silence again. His voice was low, steady. If those things of yours eat everything, what happens when there's nothing left to eat? I glanced up from the console, still smiling. There's always something left. Steve frowned slightly, but didn't comment. Natasha's eyes flicked to me, unreadable. Clint raised an eyebrow, then looked away. Fury's jaw tightened, but he didn't ask again. Thor stayed unmoving, his hammer firm. Loki's smirk had thinned, but his eyes were sharp, studying every word. The hum of engines filled the silence once more. Hours later, the jet finally dipped lower. The comm crackled with the pilot's voice, approaching secure sight. Fury gave a short nod. Prepare to unload. Thor didn't move. I stay with him. Steve adjusted his shield. We all do. Natasha holstered her pistols again. Clint strung his bow, expression calm. I tapped the console, the drones outside tightening their circle. The swarm freighters on the ground shifted formation, converging on the site below. Loki sneered faintly, his voice calm. New cage, same end. Thor's reply was blunt. Not for you to choose. The jet began its descent. The swarm circled closer. The prisoner remained bound. Marvel, reborn as the brother of Tony Stark, bio-genius, create Queen Zerg at the start. Chapter 51, Arrival at the Site. The jet's engines whined lower as we broke through a layer of grey clouds. The vibration shifted underfoot, heavier now, landing gear straining against the weight of both the transport and the god we had strapped to the floor. Through the narrow windows, the ground below spread into view. An isolated facility cut into the landscape, a flat expanse of reinforced steel pads ringed by perimeter fencing. Shield trucks sat in rows, headlights cutting through the mist. Soldiers waited in formation, rifles raised but steady. Fury didn't move. His posture was locked, arms crossed, one eye fixed on Loki, who still lay bound under resin with Mjolnir pressed across his chest. Thor hadn't shifted once either. He sat planted above his brother, hammer steady, jaw tight. Steve stood ready with his shield. Natasha rested her elbows on her knees, face calm, eyes scanning. Clint looked almost casual, leaning against the wall with his bow, but the string was still taut. I stretched out at the back of the cabin, one leg crossed over the other, console balanced loosely in my lap. The drones on the screen outside circled the jet in a neat ring, black dots moving with military precision. I hummed quietly, then grinned. Nice reception out there. You always roll out this many red carpets, Fury, or am I just special? His eye flicked to me. You're not funny. I've been told otherwise, I replied cheerfully, usually after a few drinks. Steve gave me a look, half warning, half weary tolerance. Clint smirked faintly like he was trying not to laugh. Natasha didn't move. Thor didn't even blink. The jet jolted as it touched down. The ramp began to lower with a hiss, letting in the cool air from outside. The swarm buzzed faintly in the distance, holding position but visible through the mist. Workers and soldiers clung to the sides of shield trucks, mandibles snapping idly as if waiting for a command. The shield infantry outside shifted nervously at the sight of them. I stretched my arms over my head, yawning dramatically. Well, time to show off the prize. Thor ignored me. He pressed the hammer harder into Loki's chest as the god sneered faintly. You'll parade me again. How predictable. Don't flatter yourself, I shot back lightly. You're not that fun to look at. Clint chuckled once. Steve shot him the same look he'd given me. We moved. Thor hauled Loki upright, Mjolnir still pinning him as ant soldiers swarmed around his resin-bound form. Beetles braced the ramp, their shells clanging against the metal as they formed a wall to guide the descent. Wasps circled low, wings buzzing sharp. The shield soldiers outside raised their rifles higher at the sight, but Fury barked, "Stand down." They obeyed instantly, though their grips stayed tight. Loki sneered wider, looking around at the guns, the swarm, the Avengers bracing around him. So many guards, for one prisoner. Thor didn't answer. Steve adjusted his shield strap as he moved down the ramp beside the god. Natasha followed in silence, her eyes flicking between the shield soldiers. Clint descended last, bow lowered but ready. I strolled behind, hands in my pockets, humming under my breath. On the tarmac, the standoff began immediately. 24 shield agents stood in tight lines, rifles leveled. A reinforced transport cage sat open behind them, glowing restraints lining its interior. Fury stepped forward, voice sharp. He goes in there. Thor planted himself in front of Loki, hammer sparking faintly. He goes to Asgard. Fury's tone didn't change. He goes into shield custody until arrangements are made. Thor's grip tightened. He is my brother. He will answer for crimes against Asgard and Midgard alike. Steve stepped between them quickly, shield raised halfway in caution. We're not letting him out of anyone's sight. Let's not start swinging hammers here. Natasha spoke evenly, her tone practical. Moving him into Shield's cell buys us time. Fighting over him out here doesn't. Clint muttered, his bow string creaking slightly. Plus, if he slips while you're arguing, I'm not chasing him twice. I grinned, stepping closer. Hey, if this is a custody battle, I call visiting rights every other weekend. Steve shot me another look, but Clint actually laughed under his breath. Even Natasha's lip twitched faintly before she hid it. Thor's glare didn't move. He is not yours to command. Relax, I said with a cheerful shrug. Nobody is saying he is. We're all just trying not to make a mess in front of the babysitters with guns. I gestured at the rows of shield soldiers watching, most of whom were glancing nervously at the drones crawling along the edge of the pad. Fury's eyes shifted to me again hard. This isn't a joke. Neither is my sense of fashion, but here we are, I replied smoothly. Steve sighed audibly. The standoff stretched. Thor refused to step aside. Fury refused to lower the order. Loki lay smirking on the resin floor, clearly enjoying the conflict. Finally, Steve spoke, his voice steady. He stays restrained. He stays under watch. But he gets moved into a secure cell until there's an official decision. Thor's jaw flexed. His hammer crackled faintly, but after a long moment he gave a short nod. I will not leave him. Fury gave a reluctant nod of his own. Fine, but Shield controls the cell. Steve exhaled. Then let's move him before he tries something else. Loki's sneer deepened. By all means, my cage awaits. I clapped my hands together lightly. Great, glad we reached consensus without property damage. That's character growth, guys. Natasha ignored me, already signaling to the agents to open the transport cage. Clint muttered, character growth, ha, didn't think you'd be the one measuring that. I smirked, I'm versatile. The transfer began. Ant soldiers dragged Loki across the pad, their mandibles clamped tight on resin. Beetles pressed against the cage's edges, keeping shield soldiers at a distance. Wasps circled low, their buzzing making rifles twitch nervously. The agent stepped back, leaving only Fury near the entrance. His eye followed every movement, his hand resting lightly near his holster. Thor shoved Loki inside, Mjolnir slamming against the floor. Lightning sparked across the restraints. The god grimaced faintly, but didn't resist as the resin locked into the glowing seals. Fury gestured sharply, and the door clanged shut. The locks sealed with a heavy thud. The cage hummed, blue light crawling across its frame. For the first time since leaving New York, Loki was fully contained. The silence stretched again. The shield soldiers lowered their rifles slightly, though their grips stayed tense. The swarm shifted outward, settling into a guard ring around the facility. Steve looked back at Fury. That's it for now. He stays here. Nobody moves him without all of us. Fury didn't reply immediately. His eye flicked once more to me, then to the drones circling outside. Finally, he nodded. For now. Thor stood rigid in front of the cage, hammer in hand. Natasha holstered her pistols, but stayed close. Clint leaned on his bow like he was waiting for the next argument. I stretched again, grinning. Well, that was a productive landing. No hammer to the head, no friendly fire. 10 out of 10 teamwork. Steve groaned softly, rubbing at his forehead. Clint laughed outright this time. Natasha shook her head, but didn't argue. Fury didn't smile. Loki did. Chapter 52, Shadows in the Facility. The cage hummed with low, steady energy. Blue light flickered across the resin that still coated Loki's body, binding him even tighter under the glow of shield restraints. He lay there smirking, as if every second locked inside was a private joke only he understood. Thor stood directly in front of the cell, Mjolnir planted firmly against the floor. He hadn't moved since the door sealed. Steve leaned against a nearby wall, shield resting upright beside him. Natasha crouched near the corner console, tapping through surveillance feeds with sharp precision. Clint sat on a crate, stringing his bow, every movement casual, but his eyes never leaving the cage. I sprawled across the bench opposite the cell, one foot propped up, console in my hands. The drones outside still moved in neat patterns, surrounding the entire facility. I hummed lightly as I scrolled through their formations, flicking the screen now and then. Fury stood a few paces back, arms crossed, his eye flicking between Loki, the Avengers, and the swarm feed on my console. His jaw was tight enough to crack. The silence stretched. Finally, Clint spoke, his tone dry. So, anybody want to take bets on how long before he tries something? Not long, Natasha replied evenly. Loki's smirk widened faintly. How predictable. I grinned at Clint. I've got 20 on him cracking a joke before making an actual move. Call it a warm-up act. Steve frowned, straightening slightly. This isn't a game. Everything's a game if you keep score, I said, shrugging cheerfully. Steve gave me a look that said he wasn't amused. Clint actually snorted, and Natasha's lip twitched before she looked back at the screens. Thor didn't react at all. His hammer stayed planted. Hours passed. The facility settled into a tense rhythm. Shield agents rotated guard shifts at the outer doors, their boots clicking against steel as they marched. The drones outside buzzed faintly, their shadows sweeping across the windows when they passed too close. Steve checked in with each guard rotation personally. Natasha reviewed the surveillance grid 3 times over, her eyes narrowing each time a feed flickered. Clint stayed on his crate, fletching arrows, until he had an entire quiver lined up beside him. I lounged against the bench, tossing a small gadget in my hand, catching it lazily. Every time Fury's eye flicked toward me, I winked just to irritate him. He didn't rise to it, but his jaw clenched tighter. Loki's smirk never faded. It was past midnight when the first sound came. A faint scrape. Natasha caught it first, her head snapping toward the far corridor. Did you hear that? Steve was already moving, shield up. Clint slid an arrow into place without a word. Thor's hammer lifted slightly, sparks crackling across the head. I raised an eyebrow, sitting up. Well, that's not the janitor. Fury barked toward the outer guards, his tone sharp. Report. Static crackled back through the comm. No voices. Natasha's expression tightened. That's wrong. Steve gave a short nod. Positions. The scrape turned into a heavy clang as the outer door forced open. 3 SHIELD agents stepped through, rifles raised. Their uniforms were perfect, their faces calm, but their eyes were wrong. Too sharp, too cold. Clint muttered, called it. I grinned. Hydra dress code really is versatile. The agents didn't speak. They raised their rifles higher and opened fire. Steve's shield snapped up instantly, the bullets ricocheting harmlessly. Natasha ducked low, rolling behind a console before firing sharp bursts back. Clint's arrow flew in the same instant, exploding against the first agent's chest and throwing him into the wall. Thor hurled Mjolnir, the hammer slamming into the second with a bone-cracking thud before whipping back into his hand. The third kept firing, pushing forward, until a wasp drone crashed through the window, claws sinking into his shoulders. He screamed as it dragged him backward, wings buzzing violently before tearing him off his feet. The cell hummed behind us. Loki laughed softly, his voice carrying. My, even your allies cannot tell friend from foe. Shut up, Steve barked, shield raised as he advanced toward the fallen Hydra agent. Natasha crouched low, checking the body of the one Clint had dropped. Her voice came sharp. Hydra! She ripped open the sleeve to reveal the mark hidden under the fabric. Fury swore under his breath. They're embedded deeper than I thought. Clint loaded another arrow. So what's the over-under on more showing up? I tilted my head, grinning. Oh, I'd say, higher than you want, lower than I'd enjoy. Steve shot me another look, this one sharper. Focus. Relax, I said cheerfully. I can multitask. The console in my hand buzzed. I glanced down. Dozens of drones outside were shifting. Movement near the perimeter. More company, I said, standing. Lots more. The next wave hit harder. Explosions rocked the side of the facility as Hydra operatives breached the walls. Smoke poured in through the cracks. SHIELD agents scrambled to respond, their rifles barking through the haze. My swarm surged instantly. Wasps screamed through the smoke, claws tearing rifles from hands. Ant soldiers poured through the breaches, mandibles snapping, dragging intruders into the dark. Beetles braced against the shattered walls, their shells sealing gaps as workers smeared resin thick to hold. Steve pushed forward, shield slamming into the first operative through the breach. Natasha followed, her pistols snapping in rapid bursts. Clint's arrows streaked through the smoke, each explosion lighting up another figure. Thor roared as he swung Mjolnir, lightning splitting the entire corridor. 3 Hydra operatives crumpled instantly, their weapons sparking. Loki laughed louder inside his cell, his smirk wide. Such chaos, it almost feels like home. I smirked back at him. Don't get comfortable. You're not invited to the after party. The fighting spread across the facility. SHIELD soldiers shouted orders, their boots pounding against steel. Hydra infiltrators pressed in from every breach, rifles blazing. My swarm tangled with them in thick waves, the corridors filled with the sound of mandibles clamping and wings buzzing. Steve directed squads with sharp, clipped orders. Natasha moved through the smoke like a shadow, dropping one operative after another. Clint kept firing, each arrow precise, his voice steady as he called shots. Thor carved a path with every swing of Mjolnir, lightning flashing across the walls. I tapped the console with one hand, directing drones with a grin. Left flanks clear, right flanks ugly. Don't worry, I sent friends. Fury barked orders into his comm, his eye sharp. Hold every corridor. No one gets through to the cell. Loki's laugh carried again, smooth. And yet here they come. Thor's hammer slammed against the bars of the cell, sparks flashing. Silence. Loki only smirked wider. The battle raged for nearly an hour. Hydra operatives fell one after another, their bodies dragged into resin pits by drones. The breaches sealed under thick black layers, beetles bracing against the gaps. Shield soldiers regrouped in tighter formations, rifles steady. Finally, the gunfire slowed, the smoke thinned. Steve lowered his shield, chest heaving slightly. Natasha holstered one pistol but kept the other ready. Clint leaned back against the crate, exhaling. Thor stood firm, hammer sparking faintly, his gaze still locked on Loki. I dusted off my hands, console still glowing. Well, that was lively. Who's up for round two? Fury glared at me, then swept his gaze across the ruined facility. They wanted him. Steve's jaw tightened. They didn't get him. Loki smirked faintly inside the cell. Not tonight. Thor pressed Mjolnir harder against the bars, lightning sparking again. Never. The cage hummed louder, blue light steady. The prisoner remained bound. Chapter 53. Fractures in the ranks. The smell of gunpowder still hung in the air. The floors were smeared with resin, scorch marks, and Hydra corpses. The hum of Loki's cage filled the silence, faint and steady. Fury stood in the center of the ruined command room, arms folded, his single eye scanning every detail. The agents who survived the firefight stood in two tight lines along the wall. Their uniforms were dusty, their helmets scuffed, but their rifles stayed raised. Steve moved to the front, shield still strapped to his arm. Natasha stood near the console, reviewing camera feeds with sharp eyes. Clint leaned against the wall, bow hanging loosely at his side, though an arrow was never far from his hand. Thor stood by the cage again, hammer pressed down, his gaze locked on Loki. I lounged in a chair near the corner, boots up on a desk, console balanced across my lap. The drones outside continued their patrol, wings buzzing faintly against the windows. The room was quiet until Fury spoke. His voice was clipped. Hydra agents slipped into my command, dressed in my uniforms, carrying my rifles, and I didn't see it. Steve's voice was steady. Nobody could have seen it. That excuse doesn't work for me, Fury said flatly. Natasha didn't look up from the feeds, then find who let them in. Already working on it, Fury snapped back. I lifted my head from the console, grinning. I've got a quicker method. Fury's eye cut toward me. Enlighten me. I gestured lazily toward the agents lined up against the wall. Make them sing karaoke. Hydra operatives always pick the wrong lyrics. Dead giveaway. Clint smirked, shaking his head. Natasha's lip twitched. Steve looked like he wanted to scold me but didn't bother. Thor didn't even blink. Fury's glare sharpened. This isn't funny. Depends on your sense of humor, I shot back. The tension didn't ease. Natasha switched the feed to an overhead view of the facility. Several corridors flickered static. They jammed us deeper than we thought. Half the cameras are blind. Steve frowned, so they could still be inside. Exactly, Natasha said. Clint straightened, his tone dry. Great, hide and seek, just what I wanted tonight. I leaned back in the chair, twirling the console in one hand. Don't worry, I'm undefeated at hide and seek. Steve gave me a flat look. This isn't a game. Tell that to the people hiding, I replied cheerfully. Loki chuckled faintly from the cage. You turn on each other so quickly, I don't even have to lift a finger. Thor slammed Mjolnir against the floor, lightning sparking across the cell bars. Stay silent. Loki only smirked wider. Fury turned back to the assembled agents. His voice carried sharp. Helmets off. They hesitated before obeying. Helmets clanged onto the floor in a line. Tired faces stared back. Sweat, grime, blood, but no obvious traitors. Fury scanned each one carefully. You, state your name. One by one, they rattled off names, ranks, assignments. Their voices were steady but strained. When it was done, Clint muttered, could have rehearsed. Natasha's eyes narrowed. Doesn't matter. Hydra trains for this. I stretched my arms, grinning faintly. Yeah, but it's always the eyes. You can't train the look someone gets when they're about to sell you out. Steve frowned at me. You're saying you can tell. Easily, I replied with mock confidence. I'm basically a human lie detector, only with better hair. Clint snorted again. Natasha shook her head. Fury didn't laugh. Then prove it. I stood, walking lazily along the line of agents. My hands were in my pockets, my grin wide. Each soldier straightened as I passed, sweat dripping down their temples under my gaze. I stopped in front of one man whose grip on his rifle was just a little too tight. He stared ahead, jaw locked. I tilted my head. What's your favorite color? His brow furrowed, confused. Green. I smirked. Wrong answer. Hydra's brand color, suspicious. Steve sighed loudly behind me. This isn't how we do this. I spun on my heel, pointing back at Steve with a grin. Not with that attitude. Clint was outright laughing now. Natasha ignored me, though her eyes flicked to the man I'd singled out. The agent shifted slightly, his shoulders tense. This is ridiculous. Yeah, you're right, I said casually, because normal SHIELD agents don't panic when asked their favorite color. Before Steve could interrupt, Natasha stepped forward, her pistol pressed under the man's chin in one smooth movement. Drop the rifle. The room froze. The man's jaw clenched, his grip tightened on the weapon. Steve raised his shield slightly. Nat. The man moved. His rifle snapped up. Natasha fired first. The round slammed into his shoulder, spinning him sideways. Clint's arrow followed, burying into his thigh. The man dropped to one knee, still struggling to aim. I flicked the console in my hand. A wasp drone smashed through the ceiling vent, claws digging into his arm and ripping the weapon free. He screamed, resin already spreading across his limbs as workers poured in. Steve moved forward, shield braced. Natasha wrenched the rifle away and kicked it across the floor. Clint kept his arrow trained, another already notched. The Hydra agent panted, blood dripping down his arm, his eyes wide with fury. Hail! I cut him off cheerfully. Nope, no speeches, you're not the main act. Thor stepped forward, Mjolnir sparking. He dies. Steve's voice snapped. No, he talks first. Natasha pressed her pistol harder against the man's head. Then, let's ask him. The Hydra agent snarled, but stayed pinned, resin climbing his chest. Fury's jaw tightened. Get him into interrogation, now. Two shield guards dragged the man away, resin cracking against the floor as he struggled. The rest of the agents stood stiffly, their grips on their rifles even tighter. Steve exhaled, lowering his shield. That's one. Clint muttered, how many more? Natasha holstered her pistol, her eyes sharp. Enough. Fury rubbed at his temple. This is exactly why I don't like outsiders running operations in my facilities. I dropped back into my chair, grinning. You're welcome, by the way. That was a freebie. Fury's eye snapped to me. Don't get comfortable. You don't give orders here. I smirked. Sure, But if I didn't, you'd be cleaning a corpse off the wall instead of questioning him. Steve stepped in quickly before Fury could retort. Arguing doesn't help. We need to secure the rest of the base. Thor's hammer sparked faintly. They will try again. Loki chuckled from the cage. Of course they will. Your walls crumble easily. Thor slammed the hammer against the bars, silencing him. The hum of the cage filled the silence once more. Hours dragged on. Every patrol doubled. Every corridor was searched. Hydra infiltrators were pulled from 3 more posts before dawn, each dragged into cells under resin and steel. The facility's trust fractured with every discovery. Steve spoke less, his jaw tight. Natasha barely looked away from the feeds. Clint's jokes grew sharper, though his arrows stayed steady. Thor didn't leave the cage. I sprawled across the bench again, grinning faintly even as the tension pressed heavier. Well, at least no one's bored anymore. No one laughed this time. Chapter 54. The Sky Splits. The hum of the containment cage filled the room. It had been the only steady sound for hours, cutting through the tension like a clock ticking down. Hydra agents had been dragged into holding cells. Shield guards were doubled up at every door. The air was sharp with suspicion, nobody daring to relax. Loki sat smirking inside his cage, resin cracked, but holding under the glowing restraints. Thor hadn't moved an inch from his post. Steve paced. Natasha tapped silently at the surveillance console. Clint leaned on his bow like he hadn't slept in days, and Fury stood with arms crossed and jaw locked. I lounged with my feet propped up on a console, head tilted back. You know, I said brightly, for a secret government facility, you guys really do have an open-door policy. Hydra waltzes in, sings a little karaoke, and now we're all bonding over paranoia. Beautiful teamwork. Shut up, Fury snapped. Rude, I replied, smiling wider. Before anyone could argue further, the sound came. A deep, thrumming hum that rattled every panel in the ceiling. The walls shook. The monitors flickered. A column of multicolored light ripped down from the sky outside, blazing against the horizon. Thor's head snapped up instantly. His grip on Mjolnir tightened. The Bifrost. Steve stiffened, hand going to his shield. Natasha pushed away from the console, pistols drawn in a blink. Clint straightened, his bowstring tightening. I tilted my head, grinning. Oh good, visitors. We were running out of entertainment. Fury's voice was sharp, barking into his comm. All units outside now. Lock the perimeter. The room erupted in motion. Shield agents scrambled for the doors, rifles raised, boots pounding on steel. The swarm outside shifted formation, buzzing sharp as they converged toward the light. Resin workers scuttled into position, mandibles clacking. Through the reinforced glass, the beam was visible in full, a massive, pulsing bridge of light connecting sky to earth. At its base, armored figures were already stepping through. Thor's voice was low but firm. Asgard has come to retrieve him. Fury turned on him sharply. They don't get to storm into my facility uninvited. Thor's jaw set. He is their prisoner as much as yours. Steve stepped forward quickly, voice calm but firm. Arguing isn't going to stop a fight if one breaks out. Then prepare, Natasha said evenly, already checking her pistols. Clint muttered, eyes narrowed as he drew another arrow. Because a fight's coming. Loki smirked wider from his cage. How delightful. I spread my arms wide, still leaning back on the console. Well, somebody should at least roll out a welcome mat. I mean, they came all this way. Steve shot me a look, not helping. I'm always helping, I said cheerfully. You just don't appreciate the delivery. Fury growled low, turning back to the window. This is my facility. Nobody takes a step inside without my say-so. Thor squared his shoulders. And if you deny them, they will force it. The hum of the Bifrost filled every corner of the room. The first group stepped fully into view outside. Asgardian warriors in golden armor, shields gleaming, weapons raised. At their center, a tall figure in ornate plating strode forward, helm catching the light. His voice boomed even from outside. Thor Odinson, we come by command of All-Father. The prisoner is to return to Asgard for judgment. Thor's voice rumbled firm. I will not oppose that. Fury's eye narrowed dangerously. I will. The tension snapped sharp. Steve stepped between them quickly. Wait, just wait. If we start fighting each other, Loki gets exactly what he wants. Wise words, Loki said smoothly from the cage. Thor slammed the hammer against the bars, silencing him instantly. I grinned at Steve. Good speech. Needs more pizzazz, though. Maybe finger guns. Steve ignored me completely. Clint's lips twitched like he wanted to laugh, but didn't. Natasha kept her eyes on the outside. Fury barked orders into his comm. Line the perimeter. Don't fire unless fired upon, but don't let them pass. The swarm outside shifted into a living wall, resin braced thick, mandibles clicking loud. Shield agents lined up shoulder to shoulder behind them, rifles steady. The Asgardians stopped just short of the barrier, their weapons still raised. The leader's voice boomed again. Stand aside. This is not your concern. Thor moved closer to the window. His voice was steady, carrying through the glass. You will not enter by force, not while I am here. Fury snapped, his tone like steel. You're not in charge here. Nor are you, Thor shot back. Steve's jaw clenched. Enough. We don't need a war on top of what we just fought. Clint muttered, yeah, we're fresh out of party favors. I smirked. Speak for yourself. I've got plenty left. Steve gave me the look again. I winked at him. The Asgardian leader raised his sword. We will take him by right. The swarm hissed, wings buzzing louder. Shield rifles clicked as safeties snapped off. Thor stepped forward, hammer raised. You will not cross this threshold without my leave. Fury planted himself at Thor's side, his eye blazing. And you don't have the authority to give it. Natasha's voice cut in sharp. This is seconds from bloodshed. Clint's arrow notched tighter, and I've only got so many of these left. Steve exhaled slowly, stepping fully between Fury and Thor. His voice was calm but firm. Then nobody moves, nobody shoots. We hold position until we figure out a solution. The Asgardians didn't lower their weapons. Shield didn't either. The swarm bristled at the edge, resin cracking under the pressure. Loki laughed quietly in his cage, his smirk wide. Such unity, it warms the heart. I grinned at him. Don't flatter yourself. Nobody's doing this for you. The standoff stretched, the hum of the Bifrost still pulsing in the distance. Fury's jaw tightened further. This ends with him in shield custody. Thor's hammer sparked. This ends with him in Asgard. Steve's shield lifted slightly. This ends without blood. That's the only answer. Natasha's eyes flicked toward me. You haven't said how you want this to end. I shrugged, smiling wide. Oh, I'm just here for the drama, but if you want my vote, I say we make them arm wrestle for it. Winner takes Loki. Steve groaned under his breath. Clint outright laughed, shaking his head. Even Natasha's lip twitched before she forced it still. Fury glared. Thor ignored me completely. Outside, the Asgardians still waited. The cage still hummed. The standoff wasn't breaking. Chapter 55. Shield and Hammer. The Bifrost light still pulsed through the reinforced windows, throwing long streaks across the floor. Outside, the Asgardian warriors hadn't budged, their shields raised, their helms gleaming. At their front, the armored envoy kept his sword raised high, every inch his posture screaming authority. Inside, Fury and Thor stood almost nose to nose, voices sharp, tempers high. Shield rifles lined one side of the room. The swarm filled the gaps along the walls, their mandibles clicking. I stayed leaned back in my chair, arms crossed behind my head, a grin plastered across my face. My swarm's camera feed ran on the console in my lap, every unit in perfect position. Honestly, the drama was better than any movie I'd seen. Steve pushed forward hard, shield pressed between Fury and Thor, his voice cut sharp. Enough, step back. Neither man moved. Steve's tone didn't shift. Now. Thor finally drew his hammer away a fraction. Fury unclenched his jaw, but his eye still burned. The envoy outside slammed his sword against his shield, the metallic ring echoing through the room. His voice carried clear through the glass. You stall. The prisoner leaves with us. Stand aside. Fury turned sharply to the window. This is shield territory. You don't dictate anything here. Thor bristled, stepping up again. That is Asgard's command, and my word stands with it. Steve raised his hand quickly, planting it against Thor's chest to hold him back. His eyes darted to Fury. You both want the same thing, him contained, him judged, so we find a way without drawing weapons on each other. Natasha's voice came level from the console. They're not bluffing. If we push, they'll fight. Clint added from his post near the door, voice casual but steady. And if they fight, we're outnumbered and outclassed. No offense, Thor. Thor didn't even glance at him. Loki chuckled from his cage. How refreshing. Even your allies admit the imbalance. Thor's hammer sparked against the floor, lightning crawling up its handle. Be silent. Make me, Loki purred. I whistled low, stretching out across the chair. All right, but if this family drama escalates any further, someone's breaking the furniture. And between you and me, Fury doesn't seem like the type to refund security deposits. Steve turned his head just enough to give me that tight-lipped look he always did when I spoke. Didn't faze me one bit. The envoy slammed his sword again, louder. Enough delay. Surrender the prisoner, or Asgard will claim him by right. Fury snapped back. You try stepping through those doors, and S.H.I.E.L.D. will claim you. The swarm hissed at his words, the sound filling every corner of the chamber. Steve grit his teeth, voice sharp. Everyone stop posturing. We're not starting another war. Natasha kept her eyes locked on the monitors, tone calm. Then get them talking, before someone panics and pulls a trigger. Steve exhaled through his nose and stepped closer to the window. He raised his shield slightly, tapping it once against the frame, drawing the envoy's attention. If you came under Odin's command, then you came for justice, not chaos. Justice doesn't come from cutting down allies, so if you want him judged, you don't start with blood. The envoy tilted his head, helm catching the Bifrost glow. Justice demands he return to Asgard. Justice demands he stand trial, Steve countered. That's not the same thing. Thor stepped beside him, hammer low but still sparking. His voice softened slightly. Brother, your place is not here. You know this. Loki lounged back against the resin, smirk wide. Oh, I know many things. Silence, Thor barked again, sparks dancing. I tilted my head, still grinning. You know, Thor, for a god, you've got the patience of a teenager waiting in line for fast food. Clint smothered a laugh. Natasha didn't look up. Fury shot me a glare hot enough to peel steel. Steve ignored it all. His voice pressed firm, directed at the envoy outside. You want him, fine, but not without terms. The envoy's sword lowered a fraction. Terms. Yes, Steve said. He stays contained. He stays under guard, and Asgard doesn't step 1 foot inside this facility without agreement from both sides. Thor frowned. You cannot dictate Asgard's will. Steve turned sharply toward him. I'm not dictating, I'm negotiating, unless you want Midgard and Asgard to be enemies. The words hung heavy. Even Loki's smirk faltered for half a second. The envoy outside didn't respond immediately. His warriors shifted behind him, shields moving faintly. Natasha spoke low, almost to herself, eyes on the feed. They're waiting for someone's mistake. Clint muttered, and we're one itchy trigger away from giving it to them. I sat up finally, swinging my feet off the console, clapping my hands once. So here's a radical idea. Let's all relax. Fury, stop glaring like you're about to rupture a vein. Thor, stop sparking up like a thunderstorm every time Loki breathes. Steve's trying to play mediator, so let him play. And in the meantime, I leaned forward with a grin. How about somebody offers the nice, shiny warriors a snack? Negotiations always go better with food. Steve closed his eyes for half a second. Why are you like this? Genetics, I replied brightly. Clint chuckled openly. Natasha pressed her lips together, but didn't deny the truth of my point. Even Fury's glare cracked enough for him to mutter, "You're insufferable." I leaned back again, smiling, and yet effective. The envoy finally lowered his sword completely, though it still hung ready. His voice was firm. "We will not fight allies, but neither will we abandon command." Steve nodded once, shield still raised. Then we set a council. Asgard doesn't leave without Loki. Shield doesn't surrender custody outright. We do this together. No tricks. Fury bristled visibly, but he didn't interrupt. Thor's hammer dimmed slightly. He exhaled, his voice grudging. So be it, but Loki leaves Midgard in chains when the council is done. Steve met his eyes. Then that's what we'll decide, together. The envoy outside raised his sword in salute, then slammed it against his shield once more. We will await this council. He gestured sharply, and his warriors stepped back, reforming lines at the Bifrost perimeter. The hum of the light still pulsed, but the immediate threat ebbed. Inside, weapons lowered a fraction, shield rifles relaxed. The swarm hissed softer, resin dripping less. Loki chuckled again from his cage. How diplomatic, almost impressive, almost. Thor gripped Mjolnir tighter, but Steve put a hand out to stop him. Leave it. I smirked wide, stretching out again. Well, I don't know about you guys, but I'm calling that a win. Nobody died, nobody exploded, and we still have the world's most annoying prisoner in his box. 10 out of 10 negotiations. Clint grinned, shaking his head. Natasha allowed herself the faintest smile. Steve just sighed, his shield dropping to his side. Fury muttered, "This isn't over." Loki's smirk sharpened. "No, it's only beginning." Thor's jaw tightened. The hum of the Bifrost remained steady. The council would have to be called. Chapter 56, Council of Custody. The facility's war room had never been so crowded. The walls still bore the scorch marks of Hydra's last assault, resin layered thick across cracks in the steel. The hum of Loki's cage echoed faintly through the open doorway, a constant reminder of the prize everyone was here to argue about. Fury stood at the head of the table, arms folded tight. His one eye moved from face to face like he was already cataloguing weaknesses. Beside him sat Maria Hill, her tablet glowing faintly, posture stiff and ready. Thor sat opposite, Mjolnir resting heavily on the table. His eyes burned with the weight of Asgard's authority. Two Asgardian envoys flanked him, helms gleaming even under the harsh, artificial light. Steve sat between them, shield propped against his chair, his shoulders squared like a referee bracing for the first blow. Natasha was at his right, calm and quiet, her gaze sharp. Clint leaned against the back wall, bow unstrung but within reach. And then there was me, lounging sideways in my chair, boots up on the polished steel, twirling a drone controller between my fingers. My grin didn't falter once. The swarm's feed glowed faintly across the monitors overhead. Rows of drones braced around the perimeter, mandibles snapping, wings buzzing, Asgardians still holding their formation just beyond the resin barricades. The silence dragged until Fury finally spoke. His voice cut the air clean. "Let's keep this simple. Loki remains in shield custody until further notice. He attacked our world. He killed our people. He answers here." Thor's voice boomed back immediately. "He is Asgardian. His crimes extend beyond Midgard. He will face judgment before Odin, as is his right." The words slammed into the room like blows. Steve raised a hand quickly. "Then we start with common ground. He's guilty. He needs to be contained. Everyone here agrees on that." Containment is not enough, Thor growled. And letting him walk out of here in golden shackles isn't an option either, Fury snapped. I leaned forward cheerfully, cutting in before Steve could smooth things over. All right, let's not all break out the testosterone contest too early. Thor, we get it. Asgard wants their bad boy back. Fury, we get it. You don't trust anyone but yourself to hold a leash. How about we just skip to the part where you both admit Steve's going to play babysitter either way? Steve turned his head slowly toward me. You're not helping. Sure I am, I said with a grin. I'm expediting, big difference. Clint chuckled under his breath. Natasha's lips twitched faintly, though she didn't look up from her folded hands. Thor's eyes cut toward me, unimpressed. You mock matters that are grave. Grave's not really my vibe, I replied brightly. Fury pinched the bridge of his nose, like he was debating whether shooting me would technically count as friendly fire. Steve pressed forward. His voice was steady, firm. What about joint custody? The table stilled. Thor frowned deeply. Explain. Loki stays here, Steve said. Contained. Watched. But Asgard has a seat in the process. No decisions without your input. No trials without Odin's word considered. And S.H.I.E.L.D. has its eyes on him every second until then. Hill shifted beside Fury, her voice clipped. That compromises security. Thor slammed Mjolnir onto the table, the boom rattling every cup. That is justice. Fury's eye hardened. That's risk. I waved my hand lazily. That's called compromise, kiddos. You should try it sometime. Builds character. Steve exhaled slowly. It's the only way this doesn't end in bloodshed. Natasha finally spoke, her tone calm but cutting. He's not wrong. If either side pushes, the other pushes back harder. Loki slips through in the chaos. Nobody wins. Clint added from the wall, and I'm not in the mood to play dodge the lightning today. So yeah, let's keep this diplomatic. Thor's jaw tightened. Odin will not accept delay. Fury snapped back instantly, and I won't accept Asgard stomping into my facility like they own it. Steve's palm hit the table, not loud, not angry, just firm. Then both of you swallow it, because neither of you is walking away without the other. The silence that followed was thick. I broke it, grinning. Wow, dad voice. Didn't think you had it in you, Steve. He gave me the look again, the one that was equal parts exasperation and restraint. Clint laughed outright. Natasha didn't even bother hiding her smile this time. Thor still scowled, but his hammer didn't spark. Fury stayed rigid, but his arms unfolded a fraction. Progress. The debate stretched. Thor's envoys spoke sharply in their own tongue, then translated. Asgard will not be denied its right to try its own kin. Hill pushed back. Earth will not surrender its sovereignty in the face of alien invasion. Steve mediated, voice steady. Then Loki faces both, Asgard's judgment and Earth's, one after the other, no escape from either. Fury bristled, and who decides who goes first? I raised my hand, smirking. Rock, paper, scissors. Shut up, Fury barked. Best 2 out of 3, I offered. Steve exhaled hard. We decide as a council, not one side, not the other, both together. Thor's hammer twitched, but he finally nodded once. So be it. Fury's jaw flexed. His eye stayed hard, but after a long pause he muttered, Fine. The room loosened by a fraction. Clint actually whistled. Natasha leaned back slightly in her chair, watching them both. Loki's laugh echoed faintly from the cage beyond the doorway. How touching. My fate decided by squabbling children pretending at kings. Thor rose half out of his chair, but Steve's arm shot out, keeping him seated. Not now. I leaned sideways, calling toward the doorway. Hey, Loki, buddy, good news. You're so important, we needed 2 governments to argue over you. Must feel nice. His smirk sharpened. It feels inevitable. Thor's hammer sparked again. Steve didn't budge his arm. The council dragged on for hours. Terms were hammered out, every word debated, every clause tested. Loki would remain in S.H.I.E.L.D.'s custody under joint watch. Asgard would station envoys at the facility, with access to observe but not command. Trials would be held in sequence, order to be decided by further negotiation once Earth was stabilized. Thor bristled at every limit. Fury snapped at every concession. Steve smoothed, Natasha dissected, Clint commented dryly, and I sprinkled sarcasm like salt across the entire process. By the time the last clause was read, the Bifrost hum outside had dimmed, the Asgardian warriors still waiting in tight formation. The council broke reluctantly, but without blood. For the first time since the portal over New York had opened, there was something resembling a plan. Chapter 57, Counting the Dead. The ride back was quiet. The shield jet dropped me near the edge of my estate, its engines still loud in the distance as I walked toward the gates. The guards didn't say anything. They never did. Not when the air smelled of resin and the ground shook faintly beneath the soil. The main doors to the house opened automatically. The monitors inside flickered to life, each feed locked on a different sector of the hive. Thousands of creatures moved across the screens, some dragging carcasses, some stacking resin, others pacing like soldiers waiting for orders. I tossed my jacket onto a chair and kicked my boots off. Home sweet bug nest. The console lit up on the center table, running numbers across the display. Casualties, production, egg counts. I whistled low. Yeesh, that bad, huh? The numbers didn't lie. From the battle in New York, nearly 25% of drones had been shredded by Chitauri fire. 6 queens were dead, their resin-slick corpses sealed by their own workers. Dozens more had taken wounds, but were still functioning.